A dream on his wrist. Jamal stood frozen for a moment after the employee's dismissive comment. His fingers still gripped the cool metal of the Omega Seamaster, but it felt like the weight of the watch had shifted. No longer just a symbol of triumph, it now seemed to carry the sting of judgment. The air around him had thickened, and the luxurious store, which had once felt like the manifestation of his dreams, now felt like a fortress he wasn't welcome in. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the words the employee had said lingered in his mind. People like you. What did that even mean? He had no idea what the man had meant by that, but Jamal knew he had heard that kind of judgment before, in 1,000 subtle ways. It was the kind of discrimination that didn't scream loudly, but whispered in the way people looked at you, the way they questioned your place in certain spaces, the way they assumed you weren't good enough to belong. He looked around the store again, this time with a sharper awareness. The marble floors, the glass cases, the perfect lighting. It all looked even more cold and impersonal now. There was an unspoken exclusivity here, one that wasn't just about wealth, but about belonging to a certain kind of world. A world where someone like Jamal, someone who didn't look like the typical high-end customer, wasn't meant to exist, at least not in the way he had envisioned. Jamal fought the urge to leave, to turn around and walk out with his head down. He had come too far for that. But the longer he stood there, the more the words of that employee echoed in his mind. Was he really out of place here? Was his presence an intrusion on something he had no right to aspire to? Suddenly, a female voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "Can I help you, sir?" Jamal turned to see another employee standing near the entrance to the back room. She was older, perhaps in her late 40s, with a poised demeanor that suggested experience. She had been watching him from a distance while the younger employee had made his assumptions. Her expression was more neutral, but there was a warmth in her eyes that contrasted with the coolness of the store. She was the first person in the store who hadn't made him feel like he didn't belong. "I'm just looking," Jamal said, still trying to regain his composure. "I was interested in the Omega Seamaster." Her gaze shifted to the display, where the young man had placed the watch. "Ah, yes, a beautiful choice." She walked over slowly, not with the rushed indifference of the other employee, but with the sort of deliberate care that someone who had worked in luxury for years would display. "You have good taste," she said, her voice softer now. "The Omega Seamaster is one of our more popular models." Jamal nodded, but he could feel the lump in his throat. Her words didn't feel patronizing, but the weight of the situation still pressed down on him. He wasn't sure how to respond, unsure whether this kindness was genuine or just part of the usual customer service routine. The woman opened the glass case with ease and removed the watch, placing it gently in Jamal's palm. "It's not just about the watch," she continued. "It's about what it represents, the stories people carry with them when they choose a piece like this." Jamal's eyes flickered to hers. She had a quiet wisdom about her, and for the first time since stepping into the store, he felt like maybe this wasn't just about the watch. It was about him too. "What does it represent to you?" he asked, his voice steadier now. She smiled, and it wasn't one of those practiced smiles meant to flatter or close a sale. It was a smile of understanding. "It represents time," she said simply. "And what you've done with it. The moments you've spent building who you are. Some people buy watches because they want to show off, but others buy them because they've earned the right to wear them." She paused and then added, "And I can see you've earned it." Jamal's chest tightened at her words. No one had ever spoken to him like that in a store like this. No one had ever treated him like he was worthy of being there. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, and for a moment, the sting of the younger employee's comment began to fade. "I've worked hard for everything I have," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't come from money. I'm not supposed to be here." He looked down at the Omega, the smooth surface of the dial reflecting his own face. "But I want this. I want to wear it. I want to feel like I've made it." The woman nodded, as though she understood exactly what he meant. "It's not about where you come from. Jamal. It's about where you're going. And I can tell you're going places. Jamal blinked, surprised that she knew his name. She must have seen it on his credit card when he'd handed it over earlier. She had made no assumptions about him, though. No judgments based on his appearance, his background, or even his clothes. She saw him as someone who deserved the opportunity to make his own decision. I'm going to buy it, Jamal said, his voice firm now, but with a new layer of resolve. I've earned this. The woman smiled again. Good. That's the spirit. You know, most people think luxury is about showing off. But the real luxury is in the confidence to buy what you deserve, regardless of who's watching. As Jamal walked to the counter to complete his purchase, the young employee who had initially dismissed him was still standing nearby, his arms crossed. He looked at Jamal with a mixture of surprise and resentment, probably stunned that Jamal was actually going through with it. Jamal felt a flicker of satisfaction rise within him. He wasn't buying the watch to prove anything to anyone, but in that moment, he knew the young man had underestimated him, and Jamal had just proven him wrong. The older woman rang up the watch, her movements calm and professional. I'll have this gift wrapped for you, she said. And remember, it's not just about the watch. It's about how you wear it. Jamal nodded, feeling a sense of triumph that had nothing to do with the watch itself. This was more than just a purchase. It was a declaration. The power of a moment. Jamal walked out of the luxury watch store with the Omega Seamaster safely tucked into the elegant, signature bag the woman had given him. The cool evening air felt different now, less biting than before, as if the world outside was somehow less hostile than the one he had left behind inside the store. He couldn't help but glance back at the entrance, where the glistening marble still reflected the faint shadows of the lights above. He had done it. He had walked in, made his purchase, and walked out with the very watch that had been a symbol of his dreams. But as he held the bag in his hand, Jamal couldn't help but replay the encounter over and over in his mind. That employee, the one who had judged him so quickly, he could still feel the weight of the man's eyes on him. People like you don't buy watches like this. The words echoed again. But now, instead of hurting, they fueled him. He hadn't been deterred. If anything, Jamal realized, he had turned that moment into a powerful affirmation of his worth. There were always people who would try to define you by their own narrow expectations, but his worth wasn't up for negotiation. As he walked down the street, he reflected on everything that had led him to this point. It hadn't just been about money. It had been about perseverance, grit, and the quiet sacrifices that no one saw. There were days he had skipped meals, nights he had stayed up studying instead of hanging out with friends. He had worked long hours, doing jobs that drained him physically and emotionally, just to get by. But through it all, there had always been a part of him that refused to settle, that believed in something greater than just surviving. Now, holding the watch in his hands, he realized that the true value of this moment wasn't in the material wealth it represented. It was in the recognition of his journey, the late nights, the unspoken struggles, and the dreams he never let go of. The watch wasn't just an accessory. It was a testament to everything he had fought for. Jamal walked home that evening, his thoughts drifting between the sense of victory and a creeping feeling of unease. The store had been full of polished surfaces and fine jewelry, but Jamal couldn't ignore the underlying tension. The young employee's judgment had been an open reflection of a system that expected him to remain in his place, a system that tried to define him by superficial markers. But as he entered his apartment, Jamal looked around the space, small, modest, but his own. He had earned it all. And as the weight of the watch settled on his wrist later that evening, he realized that this was just the beginning. The following day, Jamal found himself back at work, trying to put the events of the previous day behind him. He worked at a tech startup, a job that he had landed after completing his degree in computer science. It wasn't his dream job, but it was a stepping stone, an opportunity to work his way up. He had learned that life didn't hand you things on a silver platter, but if you kept your head down and focused, there would always be a path forward. However, that morning, something felt different. The watch on his wrist was no longer just a luxury item. It was a reminder that the world sometimes told you no, sometimes tried to put limits on who you could be, and sometimes tried to make you believe that your dreams were out of reach. But he knew better now. Jamal stepped into the office, his usual routine of catching up on emails and preparing for meetings feeling suddenly insignificant. His new watch glimmered under the office lights as he adjusted it slightly, the weight of it on his wrist grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about status. It was about the courage to take what he had earned and wear it proudly. As Jamal sat down at his desk, his coworker, Emily, passed by. She paused for a moment, her eyes flicking to the watch before meeting his gaze. "Wow, Jamal, is that?" She trailed off, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. Jamal smiled, the pride in his expression unmistakable. "Yeah, it's the Omega Seamaster. I didn't know you were into luxury watches," Emily said, taking a seat next to him. "I mean, no offense, but I always peg you as more of a tech gear kind of guy. Something more understated." Jamal chuckled, feeling the familiar tension of people trying to box him in, to define him by their expectations. But he didn't mind. He had nothing to prove, only a story to share. "It's not about the label," he said casually, adjusting his sleeve to let the watch glint in the light. "It's about what it represents. Hard work, sacrifice, a little bit of believing in myself, even when other people didn't." Emily raised an eyebrow. "That's deep," she said, half smiling. "I like that." Jamal leaned back in his chair, feeling a surge of pride. This wasn't just about a watch. It was about rewriting the narrative. Every day, he fought against the limitations that others had set for him. Limitations based on assumptions about where he came from, how he looked, what he could afford. But he knew the truth. He wasn't defined by any of that. He defined himself. As the day wore on, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The encounter in the store, the quiet judgment he had faced, it was all a part of something larger. He was living in a world that constantly tried to push him into boxes, but each time he broke out of one, he realized just how much power he held in his own hands. The day passed quickly, filled with meetings and calls, but Jamal's mind kept drifting back to the events of yesterday. What had happened inside the store had shaken him, but it had also sparked something deep within. He wasn't going to let the judgment of one person, or 100, stop him. When he arrived home that night, he sat in front of his mirror, staring at the watch on his wrist. It gleamed under the soft light, a symbol of something far more important than money or luxury. Jamal knew he wasn't just wearing a watch. He was wearing his story, and the world had no choice but to watch him succeed. The unseen battle. The days following Jamal's purchase of the Omega Seamaster seemed to blend into each other. Work became a series of routine tasks, with Jamal going through the motions, but always feeling the weight of his new watch on his wrist, a constant reminder that something was changing inside him. It wasn't just about the watch. It was about the way he saw himself, and the way he was starting to demand more from life. Despite the quiet satisfaction that came with having accomplished something significant, there was an underlying unease that Jamal couldn't shake. The memory of the store and the judgmental gaze of the young employee still lingered in his mind, though the older woman's words of encouragement had helped him silence the doubts that had begun to creep in. Still, the world wasn't always as welcoming as he'd hoped, and he could feel the subtle shift in the way people viewed him. It wasn't just the looks he had gotten in the office, when Emily had noticed his watch and made her offhand comment about his usual tech gear style. It was the more insidious glances, the silent evaluations that others were making as they saw him rise, slowly but surely, above what they expected of him. Jamal knew what that felt like. It wasn't new. Being underestimated, dismissed, and judged based on the color of his skin, his socioeconomic background, and even his accent was something he had become all too familiar with. But the watch had become a symbol not just of his hard work, but of the very battle he was fighting. The fight to be seen for who he truly was, not just who others assumed him to be. It was late one Friday afternoon when Jamal found himself in the office break room, grabbing a cup of coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow over the small room filled with whiteboards and vending machines. As he stirred his coffee, he overheard a conversation between two of his coworkers, Jake and Brian, who were deep in discussion by the window. "Man, did you see that Jamal guy?" Jake said with a chuckle. "He's really stepping it up. First, he buys that fancy watch, and now he's all confident, walking around like he owns the place." Brian laughed, though it was laced with something that sounded more like discomfort than amusement. "I mean, yeah, he's been here a while, but it's like he thinks he belongs in that world now. I get it, hard work and all, but it just feels off, you know." Jamal's grip tightened around the coffee cup. His heart raced, but he didn't let it show. He leaned against the counter, pretending to pour some more milk into his coffee while pretending he hadn't heard them. It was the same old song, different tune. People like them, people who had never been forced to prove their worth every single day, had a hard time understanding what it meant to fight for a seat at the table. Jake and Brian weren't necessarily bad people. They weren't openly hostile or rude. But their words carried an undercurrent of something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored. It was the quiet dismissal of the success of someone who didn't fit the mold. He had spent years in rooms like this, overhearing similar comments. It didn't matter that he had worked harder than most, that he had done everything he could to earn his place. They would always view him as an outsider, no matter how much he achieved. Jamal set the coffee cup down, letting out a slow breath. He knew this wasn't just about the watch. It was about the fact that he had dared to elevate himself, to step outside the quiet, invisible box society had placed him in. And it was that step that made others uncomfortable. That evening, as Jamal left the office, he received a text message from his mother. It was a simple message, just a few words, but the warmth and love behind them hit him like a wave of comfort. "How's the new job going, baby? I'm proud of you." Her words reminded him of the long, hard journey he had taken to get to this point. She had been his rock, his unshakable belief that no matter how many times he fell, he could always rise again. He knew she would never judge him, never doubt his ability to break through the barriers others put in front of him. But the truth was, it was hard to shake the feeling that he was still fighting that invisible battle every day. He sat on the edge of his bed that evening, staring at the watch resting on his wrist. The lights from the city outside flickered through his window, casting long shadows across the room. It was strange how something as small as a watch could carry so much weight. The world looked at him differently now, even if they weren't always vocal about it. But Jamal was starting to see it differently too. For a long time, he had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, constantly trying to prove that he belonged. He had built his life on the idea that he needed to work harder, be better, just to keep up. But now, as he looked at the watch, he realized it was more than just a symbol of success. It was a symbol of his own transformation. He wasn't trying to fit into their world anymore. He was building his own. The next day, Jamal decided to take a different route home from work, walking through a park that sat just outside the heart of the city. It was a place where he could think clearly, where the noise of the world seemed to fade for just a little while. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow over the trees, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. As he sat on one of the benches, he pulled out his phone to text his mother. He had a moment of quiet reflection before he typed out his response. "I'm doing good, Ma, but sometimes it feels like I'm still fighting. Like I'm still trying to prove I deserve to be here. It's exhausting." He paused before hitting send, wondering if he had made the right choice. But it was the truth. Despite everything he had accomplished, despite the watch on his wrist, he felt like he was still battling something invisible, something others couldn't see. A few moments later, his phone buzzed with a response. "Baby, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've already made it. The fight is only in your mind." Wear that watch and know that you've earned every second of it." Jamal smiled as he read her words. He had already been fighting for so long, but perhaps it was time to stop fighting the world's perception of him. Perhaps it was time to stop trying to prove his worth and simply live it. As he stood up to leave, he felt lighter than he had in days. The invisible weight that had been clinging to him for so long seemed to fade away, just a little bit. He wasn't bound by anyone else's expectations. He was writing his own story now, one where he decided what success looked like, one where he would no longer be made to feel like an outsider. Jamal smiled as he walked into the twilight, the Omega Seamaster shining on his wrist. Unapologetically, proudly, and without the need for anyone's permission. Breaking through the walls. The weeks following Jamal's decision to stop seeking approval felt like a breakthrough. He woke up every day with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying with him the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove himself to the world. The watch on his wrist, once a symbol of external validation, had now become an emblem of his internal transformation, a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he was willing to go. It wasn't just the watch, though. It was the way he started looking at life differently, no longer allowing people's judgments to dictate his actions or his worth. And it was not just the people around him, his coworkers, his neighbors, even the world at large, that had noticed this change. He had noticed it too. He had become someone who no longer apologized for existing or for wanting more. His interactions at work had shifted. No longer was he the quiet, reserved guy who tried to blend in, the one who stayed in his lane. Instead, Jamal began to step up in meetings, offering his opinions without hesitation, taking on more responsibility, and even suggesting new ideas that others were quick to latch onto. His voice was no longer drowned out by the noise of the office. It was now a presence, a force that commanded attention. His manager, Sarah, had even started to see the difference. One afternoon, after a particularly productive meeting, Sarah pulled him aside. "Jamal," she began, her tone serious but warm, "I've noticed you've really come into your own these past few weeks. Your input in meetings has been valuable, and I can see your confidence growing. Keep it up." Jamal smiled, trying to mask the pride that bubbled inside him. He had always been the underdog, the one who had to fight for every inch of recognition. But now it felt as though his hard work was starting to pay off, not just in his performance, but in the way others were starting to acknowledge his value. "I appreciate that, Sarah," he said, keeping his voice steady, though a sense of accomplishment filled his chest. "I'm just getting started." That evening, as Jamal prepared for another night out with friends, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led him here. The watch was still a symbol, yes, but it was now just one piece of the puzzle. He had learned to embrace his journey, the ups and downs, the battles both seen and unseen. But what truly amazed him was how many people hadn't expected him to make it this far. They had underestimated his resilience, his drive, and his ability to keep pushing even when the world told him no. But those same people were starting to notice now. And it wasn't just his success that they were paying attention to. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet strength that radiated from within. Jamal had become someone who owned his space unapologetically, and that was more powerful than anything material. He met up with his friends later that night at a local restaurant, a trendy spot that had become one of their regular hangouts. They laughed and shared stories over dinner, but there was an air of something different. Jamal could feel it. The way his friends looked at him had changed. It was subtle, but it was there. There was admiration, respect, even envy, emotions he had once believed were reserved for those who had it all handed to them. But now, Jamal knew that those feelings weren't just given to people who were born into privilege or success. They were earned. At one point, his friend Michael leaned across the table, his eyes catching the gleam of Jamal's watch. "Man, that watch is sick," he said with a grin. "Did you really buy that yourself?" Jamal nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction wash over him. It wasn't the first time someone had asked about the watch, but this was different. Michael wasn't just acknowledging the material value. It was the respect behind the question. "Yeah, I worked for it," Jamal replied, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of his journey. "And a lot more." Michael raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "I've got to admit, I didn't think you were the type to go for something like that. But man, it looks good on you." Jamal smiled, but there was a quiet pride in his response. "It's not just about the watch. It's about everything I've done to get to this point. We all have a story, you know. But we're the ones who get to write it." As the evening wore on, Jamal couldn't help but notice the way his friends were looking at him. The energy had shifted, and he realized that they were starting to see him in a different light, not because of the watch, but because of the person he had become. The quiet, humble guy who had once kept his head down and let life happen to him was no more. In his place was someone who knew his worth and wasn't afraid to show it. The following Monday at work, Jamal found himself facing another moment of challenge. A critical project deadline was fast approaching, and the team was feeling the pressure. He had been assigned to oversee the technical aspects, and it wasn't long before the weight of responsibility started to settle on his shoulders. As he sat at his desk, reviewing the latest project specs, his phone buzzed with a message from his old mentor, Marcus. Marcus had been one of the few people who had always believed in him, even when Jamal had doubted himself. He had guided him through the early days of his career, and Jamal knew that Marcus's words had always been a source of strength. "Got this, Jamal," the message read. "The biggest battles are the ones we fight within. You've already won that one. Now go and finish what you started." The words hit Jamal hard, grounding him in the moment. He took a deep breath, his gaze flickering to the watch on his wrist once more. It wasn't just a luxury piece. It was a reminder that he had faced countless battles and had emerged stronger each time. The real challenge was no longer the obstacles in front of him. It was the belief in himself that he had cultivated over the years. The meeting that followed was intense, with everyone in the room feeling the pressure of the ticking clock. But Jamal was no longer the passive observer he had once been. He led the discussion, guiding the team through technical solutions and offering innovative ideas that the others latched onto. His confidence was infectious, and by the time the meeting ended, there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. The project was back on track, and Jamal knew that his role in it was not just as a contributor, but as a leader. That evening, as he walked home, Jamal reflected on how far he had come. The watch was still on his wrist, still gleaming in the streetlights, but now it felt less like an accessory and more like a part of his identity. He had broken through the walls that had once confined him, the walls of self-doubt, of judgment, of others' perceptions. And now he was standing tall, owning his space in a way he had never imagined possible. Jamal was no longer the person who needed validation. He was the person who validated himself. And as he looked up at the night sky, he knew that this was just the beginning. The world was vast, and he was ready to claim his place in it. The weight of victory. By now, Jamal had fully embraced the transformation he had undergone. The watch was no longer just a reflection of his external success. It was a representation of something much deeper, his own personal growth. The luxury piece of craftsmanship had become an anchor in his journey, a reminder of how far he had come from the days of self-doubt and uncertainty. His life was shifting in ways he hadn't expected. His confidence was growing, and with it, so were the opportunities around him. At work, Jamal had become more than just a participant. He was now a leader. His ideas had begun to shape the direction of the projects he was involved in. What used to be quiet suggestions were now bold proposals that others respected and took seriously. His coworkers had begun to view him differently too. They no longer saw him as the young man who had to prove his worth, but rather as someone who commanded respect, not just because of his position, but because of the way he carried himself. He didn't demand attention. Instead, he simply lived with a quiet power that made people take notice. Yet, despite the growing success, Jamal knew that the journey was far from over. Every success seemed to bring with it a new set of challenges. The watch on his wrist was no longer a symbol of his struggle to fit in, but a constant reminder that he had more to give. There was still more work to be done, more barriers to break, more people to inspire. One Thursday afternoon, the company had an important presentation to give to a potential client, a high-stakes pitch that could determine the future direction of several key projects. Jamal was asked to take the lead in the technical portion of the presentation, and his manager, Sarah, made it clear that this was an opportunity for him to further solidify his position within the team. "Jamal, I'm counting on you," Sarah said in their pre-presentation meeting. "You've got the vision. We all trust you with this." Jamal nodded, his fingers lightly tapping the face of his watch. He wasn't nervous, not anymore. He had led presentations before, but this one felt different. The room was filled with high-level executives, and the pressure was higher than it had ever been. But rather than allowing the weight of the moment to suffocate him, Jamal allowed it to fuel him. As the presentation began, Jamal stood in front of the room, confidently walking the audience through the details of his proposal. He could feel the eyes of the executives on him, their skepticism palpable as they examined his every move. He knew what they were thinking. They saw him as just another young man trying to rise through the ranks. They might have written him off as another face in the crowd, but he was about to prove them wrong. With every slide he presented, every technical detail he shared, Jamal could feel the power of his words filling the room. This was his moment, not just to secure the project for the company, but to finally silence any doubt that had ever been cast on his abilities. As he spoke, he noticed that the room's energy began to shift. The executives, who had once seemed so distant, were now leaning forward, captivated by his insight and confident delivery. When the presentation finally came to an end, there was a moment of silence. Then one of the senior executives, a woman in her late 40s with piercing eyes, raised her hand. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice cool and collected. "That was impressive. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this. I have to admit, I wasn't expecting this level of depth from someone your age." Jamal felt a slight smirk tug at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't the first time he had heard that sort of backhanded compliment. "Thank you," he said, maintaining eye contact. "Age doesn't define expertise. Hard work does." The woman paused, clearly taken aback by his response. The room fell into a silence, and for a moment, Jamal felt the weight of every glance focused on him. But this time, it didn't feel like a challenge. It felt like an opportunity to prove once again that he wasn't just a man with a watch. He was a force to be reckoned with. Later that week, after the dust had settled from the presentation, Jamal received an email from Sarah. It was brief, but the words held weight. "You did it, Jamal." The client signed on. "This is a huge win, and I'm proud of you. This is just the beginning." Jamal couldn't help but smile as he read the message. The sense of accomplishment was there, yes, but it was different now. He wasn't seeking validation from Sarah, from his colleagues, or from anyone else. He was proud because he knew he had earned it, and he knew his worth. It wasn't about the watch or the accolades. It was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had become the man he had always aspired to be. The weekend came quickly, and Jamal found himself at a crossroads. He had accomplished so much in such a short time, but the hunger for more had only grown. He began to realize that the journey wasn't just about proving others wrong or overcoming obstacles. It was about the personal satisfaction of pushing his own limits. He decided to take a weekend trip, something he hadn't done in years. It wasn't about escaping the pressures of work. It was about finding clarity, a way to reconnect with himself away from the noise. He chose a small, quiet town upstate, a place known for its hiking trails and peaceful scenery. There, he could recharge and reflect on what he had built for himself. As he arrived at the cabin he had rented for the weekend, Jamal felt a wave of peace wash over him. The silence of the woods, broken only by the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of leaves, was a welcome change from the constant hum of the city. He unpacked his bag, setting the watch carefully on the bedside table before heading out for a long walk in the woods. With every step he took, Jamal felt the weight of the world grow lighter. It wasn't that the challenges had disappeared. It was that he had changed the way he viewed them. They were no longer obstacles. They were opportunities. Opportunities to rise higher, to break through the limits of what he thought was possible. The watch on his wrist was a constant reminder of that. It wasn't just a symbol of his success. It was a tool that had helped him reshape his life. It had pushed him to be bolder, to be more unapologetic, and to be proud of the person he had become. As he stood at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast expanse of forest below, Jamal took a deep breath. This was his moment of clarity. He wasn't just a man with a luxury watch. He was a man who had earned every step of the journey, and the road ahead was his to define. The final lesson. The days following Jamal's retreat into the peaceful countryside became a turning point in his journey. Standing at the edge of the cliff, staring out at the vast, open world before him, something clicked within him. It wasn't just about climbing the ladder, proving others wrong, or even collecting the symbols of success like his luxury watch. It was about understanding his place in the world and recognizing the power of his own narrative. When Jamal returned to the city, he carried with him a newfound sense of inner peace, a quiet confidence that came not from external validation, but from a deep-rooted belief in his own capabilities. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. What he had achieved wasn't just the result of ambition or external measures. It was the product of his resilience, his self-awareness, and his unwavering commitment to his personal growth. As he settled back into the rhythm of his life, Jamal began to see things differently. The noise of the world, the judgment of others, the pressures of success, all of it seemed to fade into the background. He began to focus on what truly mattered, building meaningful relationships, contributing to his community, and continuing to challenge himself. One Monday morning, as he sat at his desk in the office, Jamal received an email that made his heart skip a beat. It was an invitation to speak at a prestigious industry conference. The event was one of the most respected in his field, and the opportunity to address an audience of influential figures from across the globe was something that Jamal had once only dreamed of. At first, Jamal was taken aback. He had never envisioned himself speaking in front of large crowds, let alone at such an esteemed event. But then he thought back to the moments of self-discovery he had experienced over the past few months. The countless lessons he had learned, the challenges he had faced, and the way he had transformed both his mindset and his approach to life. He had done the hard work. He had earned his place. Without hesitation, he accepted the invitation. It was time to share his story, not just the polished, success-driven narrative, but the true, unfiltered version of it. The ups and downs, the failures, the growth, everything that had led him to this moment. As the date of the conference drew closer, Jamal spent countless hours preparing his speech. He didn't want it to be a rehearsed, corporate talk. He wanted it to be real. He wanted the audience to feel the emotion, the struggles, and the triumphs that had shaped him into the person he was today. He wanted to speak to them, not as a man with a luxury watch, but as a man who had faced adversity, who had fought against the tides of doubt and judgment, and who had emerged stronger for it. This wasn't just about giving a presentation. It was about sharing the lessons that had defined his journey. The day of the conference arrived, and Jamal found himself backstage, staring at the crowd of industry professionals filling the auditorium. The noise of conversation was deafening, but in that moment, everything felt still. He could feel his heart racing, the nerves creeping in. But this time, it was different. These nerves weren't driven by fear. They were a reminder of how much he had to share. He had worked hard to get here, and he wasn't going to let this moment slip by. His name was called, and as he walked onto the stage, a flood of memories rushed through him. Memories of the boy who had felt small, who had tried to hide in the shadows, who had been underestimated. But he was no longer that person. He stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes bright with purpose. The spotlight hit him, and he could feel the weight of the audience's gaze. But rather than feeling intimidated, he felt empowered. These people weren't here to judge him. They were here to listen. And for the first time in his life, Jamal realized he didn't need to ask for anyone's approval. He had already earned it. "I want to start by telling you all a story," Jamal began, his voice calm but confident. "Not a story of success or accolades, but a story of failure. A story of overcoming self-doubt, of fighting against the expectations that were placed on me, and of realizing that the only person who needed to believe in me was me." The audience fell silent as Jamal spoke, his words carrying the weight of years of struggle and growth. He shared the story of his journey, the moments when he had felt unseen, the times when he had been judged based on his appearance and his background. He talked about his decision to buy the luxury watch, how it had once symbolized his desire for external validation, and how it had eventually come to represent his personal transformation. "But the real lesson," Jamal continued, "wasn't in the watch. It was in the realization that I didn't need anyone to tell me I was worthy. I didn't need to wait for someone else's permission to own my success. We are all capable of more than we think, but it starts with believing in ourselves." As Jamal spoke, he could see the faces in the audience beginning to change. The skepticism was replaced with nods of understanding. Some of them were leaning forward, listening intently, while others were scribbling notes. It wasn't just a speech. It was a conversation that he had been having with himself for years, now shared with people who understood the power of resilience and self-belief. After his speech, Jamal was approached by several individuals from the audience, industry leaders, fellow speakers, and even a few journalists. They all had one thing in common. They were moved by his words. One woman, a successful entrepreneur, looked him in the eye and said, "What you said today was powerful. It's not just about climbing to the top. It's about the journey. It's about knowing who you are and owning it. Thank you for reminding me of that." Jamal smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This was why he had come. Not to prove anything to anyone, but to share his truth, to connect with others who had faced similar struggles, and to inspire them to keep going. He had learned the hard way that true success wasn't measured by titles, wealth, or material possessions. It was measured by the strength to overcome, the courage to be vulnerable, and the will to keep moving forward no matter the obstacles. As the day ended and Jamal left the conference, he realized something profound. The luxury watch on his wrist no longer defined him. He didn't need it to prove anything to anyone. What mattered now was the man he had become, the man who had learned to believe in himself, the man who had risen above the judgments of others, and the man who was ready to take on the world with nothing but his own strength and conviction. He had become the man he had always hoped to be. And the journey, it had only just begun.